My name is Sarah Chen, and this is the story of how I transformed from the family embarrassment into someone who could literally drop out of the sky and change everything. The nightmare began when I was 9 years old. My parents, Michael and Linda Chen, died in a house fire that started from faulty electrical wiring in our modest two-story home on Elm Street. I remember waking up to smoke and my mother screaming my name. Remember the firefighter carrying me out while I watched orange flames consume everything I had ever known. In one terrible night, I lost my parents, my home, and every sense of security I had ever felt. The custody battle that followed was more about money than love. My father had 2 siblings, his sister Margaret, who worked as a nurse and lived in a small apartment with her husband and 3 kids, and his brother Richard, who owned a chain of luxury car dealerships and lived in what could only be described as a mansion in the wealthiest part of town. The decision seemed obvious to everyone involved in the legal proceedings. Richard had money, space, and resources. Margaret was already struggling to support her own family on 2 modest incomes. The court appointed Richard as my guardian, believing they were giving me the best possible chance at a good life. What they didn't understand was that Richardson, yes, he had changed his last name from Chen to Richardson when he started his business, claiming it sounded more professional, viewed everything in terms of profit and loss. Taking in his dead brother's daughter was a significant loss with no clear return on investment. Richard lived in an 8-bedroom colonial mansion on 15 acres of land, complete with a tennis court, swimming pool, and 3-car garage that housed his collection of luxury vehicles. His wife Victoria was a former beauty queen who spent her days planning charity galas and managing their social calendar. Their 2 children, James and Sophia, were 14 and 16 when I arrived, and they had never wanted for anything in their entire lives. From the moment I walked into their house carrying a single suitcase with the few belongings that had survived the fire, Richard made it clear that I was there on sufferance. He installed me in the smallest bedroom on the 3rd floor, a space that had previously been used for storage. While James and Sophia had suites with walk-in closets and private bathrooms, I had a room barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, sharing a bathroom with the housekeeper. The rules of my existence in their house were established quickly and without negotiation. I was expected to maintain perfect grades, help with household chores, and most importantly, not embarrass the family in any way. Richard enrolled me in the same exclusive private school that James and Sophia attended, but made it clear that any extracurricular activities or social events would have to be funded by my own efforts. While my cousins received generous allowances, designer clothes, and the latest electronics, I wore secondhand uniforms and carried my books in a backpack that Richard had grudgingly purchased from a discount store. The contrast was intentional and constant, a daily reminder of my place in their carefully ordered world. Victoria treated me with the kind of polite coolness she might show to household staff. She never raised her voice or said anything directly cruel, but she had a way of making me feel invisible in my own home. She would discuss weekend plans, family vacations, and social events in front of me while making it clear that these conversations didn't include me. James and Sophia followed their parents' lead, treating me like an unfortunate obligation rather than family. At school, they would acknowledge me only when absolutely necessary, and never in a way that suggested we shared a home. They had their own friend groups, their own social circles, and their own world that I was expected to observe but never enter. The worst part wasn't the material deprivation or even the social isolation. It was the constant message that I was somehow less worthy, less valuable, less deserving of love and support than the people who happened to be born into better circumstances. Richard never let me forget that he was doing me a favor by keeping me, that I should be grateful for the roof over my head and the education he was providing. The annual Richardson family gatherings were exercises in humiliation that I came to dread. Every Christmas and Thanksgiving, extended family members would come to the mansion for elaborate dinner parties that showcased Richard's wealth and success. I was expected to attend these events, but my role was clearly defined as the charity case that Richard had graciously taken in. Richard would introduce me to guests as my brother's daughter, always with a tone that suggested this was a burden he bore with admirable grace. He would mention my parents' death in a way that invited sympathy for himself rather than for me, painting himself as the generous brother who had stepped up in a time of crisis. During these gatherings, I would listen to conversations about business deals, investment properties, and luxury vacations while serving as a living reminder of Richard's magnanimity. The other family members would pat my head and tell me how lucky I was to have such a wonderful uncle, never noticing the way their praise made me feel smaller and more insignificant with each passing year. But it was during my senior year of high school that Richard finally said the words that would change everything between us forever. I had been accepted to Stanford University with a partial academic scholarship, something I had achieved through years of perfect grades and countless hours of studying in my tiny third-floor room. I was proud of this accomplishment and foolishly thought it might earn me some recognition from the man who had raised me. The conversation took place in Richard's study, a room filled with expensive leather furniture and awards from various business organizations. I had asked to speak with him about college finances, hoping that he might be willing to help with the costs that my scholarship didn't cover. Richard listened to my presentation with the same expression he might wear while reviewing quarterly profit reports. When I finished explaining the costs and my financial aid package, he leaned back in his chair and delivered a response that still echoes in my mind today. He told me that he had already done more than enough for me over the years, that his obligation as my guardian would end when I turned 18, and that I needed to understand my place in the world. He said that elite universities like Stanford were for people like James and Sophia, who had been groomed for success since birth and had the family connections necessary to make the most of such opportunities. Then came the words that burned themselves into my memory. You need to accept reality, Sarah. You're too poor to really be part of this family. You don't have the background, the connections, or frankly, the sophistication to succeed in our world. Maybe it's time you stopped trying to reach above your station and focused on finding a path that's more appropriate for someone in your position. The cruelty of his words was matched only by the casual way he delivered them, as if he were simply stating an obvious fact rather than crushing the dreams of an 18-year-old girl who had already lost everything once. He suggested that I consider community college or perhaps a trade school, something practical that would allow me to support myself without requiring investments that he wasn't willing to make. That night, alone in my small room under the eaves of his massive house, I made a promise to myself that would shape every decision I made for the next decade. I swore that someday, somehow, I would become successful enough to prove Richard wrong about everything he believed about me, my potential, and my worth. I ended up attending Stanford using a combination of scholarships, loans, and a work-study program that had me cleaning laboratories and serving food in the cafeteria for 20 hours a week. The financial calculations were tight. After tuition, room, board, and basic expenses, I had less than $50 per month for anything beyond absolute necessities. My dorm room was in the oldest building on campus, with thin walls, unreliable heating, and a roommate who came from the kind of wealthy family that could treat Stanford like an expensive social club. While she decorated her half of the room with designer furniture and electronics, my side remained spartanly functional: a desk, a bed, and shelves lined with textbooks that I had purchased used or borrowed from the library. While my classmates were joining sororities and attending social events, I was studying in the library until closing time and working every job I could find to keep myself financially afloat. Most importantly, I worked as a research assistant for the computer science department, helping professors organize data and maintain their laboratory equipment. This position exposed me to cutting-edge research in artificial intelligence and machine learning, fields that were just beginning to show their revolutionary potential. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, who would later become my mentor and advisor, first noticed me during my sophomore year when I was working as her research assistant. She had been struggling with a data analysis problem for weeks, trying to identify patterns in financial market behavior that could be used to test new algorithmic trading strategies. I had been organizing her research files when I noticed the datasets she was working with, and I couldn't help but see patterns that her traditional statistical approaches were missing. After several days of working up the courage, I approached her with some observations about correlations she might not have considered. Dr. Martinez was initially skeptical that an undergraduate student could contribute meaningful insights to her research, but when she tested my suggestions against historical data, the results were remarkable. The patterns I had identified would have generated trading returns that far exceeded market benchmarks, even accounting for transaction costs and market volatility. This discovery led to my first real research project, working with Dr. Martinez to develop more sophisticated algorithms for financial market analysis. I spent the summer between my sophomore and junior years living in a tiny studio apartment off campus, working 18-hour days to refine mathematical models that could predict market movements with unprecedented accuracy. The breakthrough came during my junior year, when I developed a machine learning algorithm that could analyze millions of data points in real time and identify investment opportunities that human traders would never spot. The algorithm incorporated traditional financial indicators, but it also analyzed news sentiment, social media trends, weather patterns, and dozens of other variables that conventional wisdom suggested were irrelevant to market performance. When we tested the algorithm against 5 years of historical market data, the results were extraordinary. It would have generated annualized returns of over 300% during periods when most professional investors lost money, while maintaining risk levels that were actually lower than traditional investment strategies. Dr. Martinez immediately recognized the commercial potential of what we had created. She connected me with venture capital firms that specialized in financial technology, and by the spring of my junior year, I was presenting our research to investors who had previously funded companies that were now worth billions of dollars. The first presentation was terrifying. I walked into a conference room filled with men in expensive suits who had been evaluating business opportunities longer than I had been alive. They asked pointed questions about market size, competitive advantages, and scalability that I had to answer while maintaining confidence in technology that existed primarily in academic papers and computer simulations. But the data spoke for itself. When I demonstrated how our algorithm would have performed during the 2008 financial crisis, correctly predicting market crashes while identifying opportunities for profit even during the worst economic downturn in decades, the room fell silent. These were investors who had lived through that crisis, who had seen fortunes disappear overnight, and who understood exactly what kind of advantage our technology represented. By my senior year, I had formed predictive analytics solutions and raised $2 million in seed funding from a consortium of venture capital firms. The company's initial focus was developing consumer-friendly applications of our technology, creating tools that could help ordinary people make smarter decisions about their retirement accounts and personal investments. The first version of our software was designed as a mobile app that could connect to users' existing investment accounts and provide personalized recommendations based on their financial goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon. We called it Smart Invest, and we priced it as a subscription service that cost less per month than most people spent on coffee. The beta testing phase revealed something remarkable about our target market. While wealthy investors had access to sophisticated financial advisors and proprietary research, middle-class Americans were making investment decisions based on outdated information and generic advice that rarely matched their specific circumstances. Our technology could provide institutional quality analysis to anyone with a smartphone and an investment account. The official launch of Smart Invest coincided with my graduation from Stanford, and the timing couldn't have been better. The app gained 10,000 users in its first month, 50,000 by the end of the summer, and over 250,000 by Christmas. More importantly, the users who followed our recommendations were seeing investment returns that averaged 40% higher than those who relied on traditional financial advice. Success in the consumer market opened doors to institutional clients who had initially been skeptical of technology developed by a college student. Hedge funds and investment banks began reaching out to license our algorithms for their own trading operations, offering licensing fees that dwarfed our consumer subscription revenue. The first institutional client was a mid-sized hedge fund in Chicago that had been struggling to maintain performance during a period of market volatility. They licensed our technology on a trial basis, agreeing to pay us a percentage of any excess returns generated by our algorithms compared to their traditional strategies. Within 6 months, their fund was outperforming every benchmark by margins that attracted attention from institutional investors across the country. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit world of professional finance, and soon we had major investment banks and pension funds requesting demonstrations of our capabilities. Each new client brought exponentially larger licensing fees and validation of our technology's effectiveness. By the time I turned 25, Predictive Analytics Solutions was generating over $50 million in annual revenue, with clients that included some of the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world. But the real breakthrough came when we expanded our algorithms beyond traditional securities markets. We developed specialized versions for cryptocurrency trading, real estate investment analysis, and economic forecasting that could predict everything from commodity prices to currency exchange rates. The cryptocurrency module was particularly successful, launching just as Bitcoin and other digital currencies were beginning to gain mainstream acceptance. Our algorithms could analyze the unique factors that drove crypto markets: social media sentiment, regulatory announcements, technical adoption rates, and trading volume patterns, with accuracy that made early investors extremely wealthy. The real estate analysis tool became popular with both individual investors and institutional funds, providing insights that helped users identify undervalued properties and predict market trends months before they became apparent to traditional analysts. Property developers began using our software to decide where to build new projects, while investors used it to time their entry and exit from real estate markets. Each successful product launch increased the company's valuation and my personal net worth. By the time I received the invitation to Richard's Christmas dinner, my equity stake in predictive analytics solutions was worth over $2 billion, and I owned additional assets including real estate, art, and a diversified investment portfolio that had grown exponentially thanks to my own algorithms. But perhaps more importantly, I had proven that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that success was about creating value rather than inheriting advantages, and that the most meaningful achievements came from solving real problems for real people. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had once told me I was too poor to be part of his family would soon be standing on his own lawn, looking up at me with or as I stepped out of a helicopter that cost more than his house. My major was computer science with a focus on artificial intelligence, a field that fascinated me precisely because it was about creating something from nothing, about using logic and creativity to solve problems that had never been solved before. I saw parallels between programming and my own life. Both required taking complex problems and breaking them down into manageable pieces. Both rewarded persistence and analytical thinking over inherited advantages. During my junior year, I developed a machine learning algorithm for my advanced AI class that could predict stock market fluctuations with remarkable accuracy. What started as a class project became an obsession as I realized the potential applications of what I had created. I spent countless hours refining the algorithm, testing it against historical data, and expanding its capabilities. My professor, Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, recognized the commercial potential of my work and connected me with a venture capital firm that specialized in fintech startups. By my senior year, I had formed a company called Predictive Analytics Solutions and raised $2 million in seed funding to develop my algorithm into a commercial product. The first version of our software was designed for individual investors who wanted to make smarter decisions about their retirement accounts and personal investments. We created an app that could analyze market trends, assess risk factors, and provide personalized investment recommendations based on each user's financial goals and risk tolerance. But the real breakthrough came when we developed a version for institutional investors. Hedge funds and investment banks began licensing our technology, and within 2 years of graduation, my company was generating over $50 million in annual revenue. The algorithm that had started as a college homework assignment had become the foundation of a business that was transforming how people thought about investment strategy. As our client base grew, so did our capabilities. We expanded into cryptocurrency analysis, real estate market predictions, and economic forecasting. Major financial institutions were paying us millions of dollars annually for access to insights that their own teams of analysts couldn't match. By the time I turned 25, my personal net worth had exceeded $100 million. I owned a penthouse apartment in downtown San Francisco, a house in the Hamptons, and a collection of luxury cars that would have made Richard green with envy. But more importantly, I had built something meaningful, something that was helping ordinary people make better financial decisions and secure their futures. Throughout this period of explosive growth and success, I maintained minimal contact with Richard's family. They had no idea about my business ventures or my growing wealth. As far as they knew, I was just another college graduate struggling to make ends meet in the expensive San Francisco job market. This changed when Victoria called to invite me to their annual Christmas dinner, something they had stopped doing after I graduated from college. Apparently, James was bringing home his new fiancée, and Victoria wanted to present the image of a close-knit family that included all members, even the poor relation who had been taken in out of charity. The invitation was extended with the same patronizing tone that had characterized all my interactions with Richard's family. Victoria mentioned that they understood I probably couldn't afford to travel during the holidays, and that Richard would be happy to purchase a plane ticket for me if I wanted to attend. She also suggested that I shouldn't worry about bringing expensive gifts, since everyone would understand my financial limitations. For the first time in 7 years, I decided to accept their invitation. But this time, I was going to attend on my own terms. I spent weeks planning every detail of my arrival, determined to create an experience that would forever change how Richard and his family thought about me and my place in the world. This wasn't just about making a dramatic entrance, it was about orchestrating a moment that would force Richard to confront every assumption he had ever made about my potential and worth. Captain Rodriguez, the pilot I selected, had 20 years of experience flying high-profile clients including tech billionaires, Hollywood celebrities, and international diplomats. When I explained the significance of this particular flight, he became genuinely invested in ensuring that every detail was executed flawlessly. He even suggested modifications to our approach pattern that would maximize the dramatic effect of our arrival. The advanced team I hired consisted of 3 professionals who specialized in executive event coordination. They arrived at Richard's estate 2 hours before my scheduled landing, ostensibly to set up a mobile office but actually to create an atmosphere of importance and urgency that would prime the family for my arrival. The team included Sarah Mitchell, a former White House advanced staffer who understood how to create moments of maximum impact, Marcus Thompson, a technology specialist who could make any location look like a high-stakes business operation, and Diana Chen, a public relations expert who knew how to orchestrate media-worthy moments. They transformed Richard's front lawn into what appeared to be the staging area for a major corporate announcement. Multiple laptops and tablets were arranged on folding tables, creating the impression of real-time monitoring of global financial markets. Phone lines were established for what appeared to be urgent international conference calls. Even the way they dressed, matching dark suits with earpieces and briefcases, suggested that they were supporting someone of significant importance. My outfit had been selected with the same attention to detail as a political candidate's debate attire. The Armani suit was custom-tailored in charcoal gray, a color that conveyed authority without appearing flashy. The Italian leather shoes were handmade by a craftsman who typically served European royalty. The Patek Philippe watch I wore retailed for $250,000 and was recognizable to anyone who understood luxury timepieces. But perhaps the most important element of my appearance was my bearing and confidence. I had spent months working with an executive presence coach who had helped Fortune 500 CEOs command rooms full of powerful people. I learned how to project authority through posture, how to use strategic pauses in conversation for maximum effect, and how to maintain composure under pressure. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical staging. I had rehearsed various scenarios and conversation topics, anticipating how Richard and his family might react and preparing responses that would maintain my advantage throughout the evening. This wasn't about gloating or revenge, it was about definitively establishing a new dynamic based on respect rather than condescension. On the day of the dinner, as our helicopter lifted off from the private airfield outside the city, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of the moments before major business presentations to institutional investors. The flight itself was smooth and peaceful, giving me time to review my notes and center myself mentally for what was about to unfold. As we approached Richard's estate from the south, I could see the family gathered on the back terrace for their traditional pre-dinner cocktail hour. The estate looked exactly as I remembered it, immaculately landscaped grounds, the swimming pool that had once seemed impossibly luxurious, and the tennis court where James and Sophia had taken lessons that cost more per hour than minimum wage workers earned in a day. But from the perspective of someone who now owned multiple properties that dwarfed Richard's estate in both size and value, the house looked smaller and less impressive than it had in my childhood memories. The realization was both liberating and melancholy. The place that had once intimidated me so completely was now just another nice house in an expensive neighborhood. Captain Rodriguez began our descent with military precision, following the approach pattern we had rehearsed to maximize the dramatic impact of our arrival. The sound of the helicopter rotors was deliberately timed to interrupt the family's cocktail conversation and draw their attention skyward just as we became visible over the tree line. I watched through the aircraft's panoramic windows as Richard, Victoria, James, and Sophia looked up in confusion, shading their eyes against the late afternoon sun as they tried to identify the source of the approaching noise. The expressions on their faces progressed from mild curiosity to genuine puzzlement as they realized that a luxury helicopter was actually intending to land on their front lawn. The landing zone had been perfectly prepared by my advance team. Orange cones marked the safe perimeter, and the red carpet had been positioned to create the most dramatic possible pathway from the aircraft to the house. The timing was choreographed down to the second. As soon as the helicopter's skids touched the ground, my assistant sprang into coordinated action. Sarah Mitchell immediately began rolling out additional red carpet while speaking into her earpiece as if coordinating with security teams. Marcus Thompson approached the aircraft with a tablet in hand, appearing to brief me on urgent developments that had occurred during our flight. Diana Chen positioned herself to document the landing with professional photography equipment, creating the impression that this was a newsworthy event. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming. Richard's family had been expecting their poor relation to arrive in a modest rental car, probably apologizing for her delayed flight and expressing gratitude for the invitation. Instead, they were witnessing what appeared to be the arrival of a head of state or Fortune 500 CEO for an important summit meeting. I took a final deep breath, checked my appearance one last time in the helicopter's mirror, and prepared to step out onto the red carpet with the confidence that comes from knowing you've earned every dollar of your success through intelligence, determination, and relentless hard work. The moment my feet touched the red carpet, I could see Richard's face beginning to change as recognition dawned. The man who had once dismissed my potential was now watching someone who clearly commanded significant resources and respect, but his mind was still struggling to connect this powerful figure with his memories of the struggling college student he had refused to help. My assistants formed a professional formation around me as we walked toward the house, creating the impression that I was surrounded by a team of advisors and specialists who facilitated my high-level business operations. Sarah Mitchell approached with urgent-looking documents that required my immediate signature, while Marcus Thompson briefed me on what appeared to be time-sensitive investment opportunities in Asian markets. The choreography was flawless, and the psychological impact was exactly what I had hoped for. Richard, Victoria, James, and Sophia came rushing around from the back terrace, their faces displaying a progression of emotions from confusion to recognition to complete and utter shock. Victoria reached us first, her usual composure completely abandoned as she tried to process what she was seeing. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like someone trying to speak in a foreign language they didn't understand. James and Sophia followed close behind, their expressions revealing the same cognitive dissonance that was affecting their mother. The poor cousin they remembered had been replaced by someone who clearly wielded enormous power and resources, and their minds were struggling to reconcile these competing realities. But it was Richard's face that provided the most satisfaction. The man who had spent years making me feel inferior and unwelcome was now looking at me with something that could only be described as awe mixed with confusion and perhaps a touch of fear. For the first time in all the years I had known him, Richard Richardson was completely speechless. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, broken finally by the sound of my satellite phone ringing with what appeared to be an urgent call from international markets. I answered with the kind of authority that suggested global financial operations depended on my immediate attention. Marcus Thompson leaned in to whisper something about billion-dollar valuations and regulatory approvals in Singapore, while Diana Chen positioned herself to capture what appeared to be a historically significant moment in my business career. The performance was perfect, and the message was unmistakable. The little girl who had once been told she was too poor to be part of their family had grown into someone who operated on a completely different level of success and influence than anything they had ever imagined possible. I hired a personal stylist to help me select an outfit that would communicate success without appearing flashy. We settled on a perfectly tailored Armani suit in charcoal gray, paired with Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly salary and a watch that I had purchased specifically for this occasion, a limited edition Patek Philippe that retailed for over $200,000. I also arranged for a small team of assistants to arrive at Richard's house 30 minutes before my helicopter landing. They were instructed to set up what appeared to be a mobile office on his front lawn, complete with laptops, phones, and briefcases that suggested I was so busy with important business that I needed to bring my work with me even to family gatherings. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. Richard had always defined success in terms of wealth and status symbols, so I was going to speak his language in a way that he couldn't possibly misunderstand or dismiss. On December 23rd, as the helicopter lifted off from the private airfield outside the city, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of the night before my first Stanford final exam. The pilot, Captain Rodriguez, had been briefed on the significance of this flight and seemed almost as invested in the outcome as I was. As we approached Richard's estate, I could see the family gathered on the back terrace for their traditional pre-dinner cocktails. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors caused them all to look up in confusion, shading their eyes against the late afternoon sun as they tried to identify the source of the noise. The helicopter touched down smoothly on the front lawn, exactly where my advance team had prepared a landing zone. My assistants immediately sprang into action, rolling out a red carpet and forming a professional formation as if I were a head of state arriving for an important diplomatic summit. I took a deep breath, checked my appearance one final time in the helicopter's mirror, and stepped out onto the red carpet with the confidence that comes from knowing you've earned every dollar of your success through intelligence, hard work, and determination. Richard, Victoria, James, and Sophia came rushing around from the back terrace, their faces displaying a progression of emotions from confusion to recognition to complete shock. I could see Richard's mind working furiously, trying to process what he was seeing but not quite able to believe it was real. The look on his face when he finally recognized me was worth every hour I had spent building my company, every sacrifice I had made, and every night I had lain awake plotting this moment. His mouth literally fell open, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, Richard Richardson was completely speechless. "Good evening, everyone," I said calmly, walking across the red carpet as if this were the most natural entrance in the world. "I hope I'm not too late for cocktails." James was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "Sarah? How? What? Whose helicopter is that?" "Mine," I replied simply, enjoying the way that single word seemed to hang in the air like something impossible made manifest. Victoria looked like she might need to sit down. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor that had spread across her face, and I could see her struggling to reconcile the successful businesswoman standing before her with the poor college student she remembered. Sophia, who had always been particularly cruel about my secondhand clothes and lack of spending money, was staring at my outfit with barely concealed envy. I could practically see her calculating the cost of what I was wearing and coming to the uncomfortable realization that my accessories alone were worth more than her car. But it was Richard's expression that provided the most satisfaction. The man who had spent years making me feel inferior and unwelcome was now looking at me with something that could only be described as or mixed with confusion. I decided to let them process this new reality for a moment before explaining my circumstances. One of my assistants approached with a tablet and briefcase, whispering something about international markets and time-sensitive investment decisions that needed my immediate attention. "I'm terribly sorry about the dramatic arrival," I said, accepting the tablet and glancing at what appeared to be urgent business communications. "I'm in the middle of closing a rather significant acquisition, and this was the only way I could make time for family dinner without missing critical negotiations with our partners in London and Tokyo." The assistant, playing her role perfectly, mentioned something about billion-dollar valuations and regulatory approvals just loudly enough for everyone to hear clearly. Richard finally managed to speak, though his voice sounded strained and uncertain. "Sarah, I had no idea. What exactly is it that you do now?" I smiled, remembering all the times he had dismissed my dreams and ambitions as unrealistic fantasies. "I develop artificial intelligence software for financial markets. My company, Predictive Analytics Solutions, was recently valued at approximately $3.2 billion during our latest funding round, and I own roughly 68% of it." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear birds chirping in the trees around Richard's estate. I watched as he tried to calculate what 68% of $3.2 billion meant for my personal net worth, and I could see the exact moment when the magnitude of my success became clear to him. Victoria was the first to attempt a response, though her usual composure had completely abandoned her. "Billion? Did you say billion with a B?" I nodded, as if we were discussing something as mundane as the weather. We're actually preparing for an IPO next year that should value the company at closer to 10 billion. But these things are always subject to market conditions and regulatory approval. James looked like he was trying to solve a complex mathematical equation in his head. Sophia appeared to be questioning whether this was all an elaborate prank or some kind of fever dream. But Richard's face told a different story. I could see him replaying every conversation we had ever had, every dismissive comment he had made about my potential, every time he had made me feel like I was reaching above my station. The man who had once told me I was too poor to be part of his family was now standing on his own lawn, looking up at me with something approaching reverence. Captain Rodriguez approached to inform me that we would need to depart within the hour to stay on schedule for my evening meetings. This was all part of the carefully orchestrated performance, reinforcing the image that my time was so valuable and my business so critical that even family gatherings had to accommodate my professional obligations. "I'm afraid I can only stay for a brief visit tonight," I announced, handing the tablet back to my assistant. "I have a video conference with our development team in Singapore in 90 minutes, and then I'm flying to Geneva tomorrow morning for a meeting with some potential European partners." The casual way I mentioned international travel and high-stakes business meetings was having exactly the effect I had hoped for. Richard's entire worldview was being challenged by the reality of my success, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the powerful businesswoman standing before him with his memories of the scared little girl he had reluctantly taken in. "But before we discuss business," I continued, "I wanted to share some news with the family. I've recently started a charitable foundation focused on supporting children who have lost their parents. We're providing college scholarships, mentorship programs, and financial literacy education to young people who might otherwise fall through the cracks of the system." This wasn't just an additional detail for dramatic effect. It was true. The Sarah Chen Foundation had become one of my most important projects, providing comprehensive support to children aging out of foster care and those who had been raised by reluctant relatives. I had personally funded the foundation with $50 million and recruited some of the best social workers and educators in the country to run its programs. The foundation's work was deeply personal to me. Every scholarship we awarded, every mentorship relationship we facilitated, and every success story we helped create was a reminder that circumstances don't determine destiny, that intelligence and determination can overcome almost any obstacle. Richard's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, settling on a pale shade that suggested he was having genuine difficulty processing this new reality. The same man who had once lectured me about accepting my limitations was now confronted with evidence that those limitations had been entirely imaginary. During the brief cocktail hour before dinner, the entire family dynamic shifted in ways that would have been impossible to imagine just hours earlier. Richard, who had always dominated conversations with stories of his business achievements and financial success, was now asking me questions about my work with the deference typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. James and Sophia, who had spent years treating me like an embarrassing burden, were suddenly intensely interested in my career path and eager to know whether I might have networking opportunities or job openings at my company. The transformation was so complete that it would have been comical if it hadn't been so personally satisfying. Victoria kept staring at my jewelry and accessories with barely concealed amazement, clearly trying to estimate their value and coming to the uncomfortable realization that I was now wearing more wealth than she had ever possessed. But the most meaningful moment came when Richard pulled me aside as we were moving from cocktails to dinner. "Sarah," he said, and I could see that the words were difficult for him to form, "I owe you an apology that's about 7 years overdue. I clearly misjudged your potential, and I said some things that I deeply regret." I looked at this man who had made my teenage years so much harder than they needed to be, who had crushed my confidence and made me feel like I didn't deserve the same opportunities as his biological children. Part of me wanted to be vindictive, to make him suffer the way he had made me suffer. But standing there in my tailored suit, with my helicopter waiting on his front lawn and my billion-dollar company's future spread out before me, I realized that the best revenge truly was living well. Richard's grudging apology represented a complete acknowledgement that everything he had believed about me, my potential, and my place in the world had been fundamentally wrong. "I appreciate that, Uncle Richard," I said finally, "and I hope you understand now that being poor was never about lacking ambition or intelligence. It was simply about lacking opportunity and support. Fortunately, I was able to create my own opportunities. As dinner progressed, I shared more details about my company's work and my foundation's mission. I talked about the artificial intelligence algorithms we had developed, the financial institutions that relied on our software, and the young people whose lives were being transformed through our scholarship programs. But I also made sure to acknowledge the role that my difficult childhood had played in shaping my determination to succeed. Every dismissive comment, every reminder of my financial limitations, and every moment when I felt like I didn't belong had contributed to the drive that eventually led to my success. The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard's attempts to make me feel inferior had actually provided the motivation I needed to exceed his wildest expectations. His lack of faith in my potential had become the fuel for achieving something he himself had never imagined possible. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave for my scheduled business calls, Richard asked if he could speak with me privately one more time. We stepped out onto the terrace where I had watched so many family gatherings from the margins, feeling like an outsider looking in. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a weight of regret that I had never heard before, "I want you to know that your success hasn't just proven me wrong, it's taught me something important about family and potential." I was so focused on the advantages I thought mattered that I completely missed the most important advantage of all, your character and determination. He paused, looking out over the grounds where my helicopter sat waiting, its rotors beginning to spin up for departure. I wasted years believing that success was something that could only be inherited or purchased, he continued. You've shown me that real success comes from something much more valuable, the refusal to accept other people's limitations on your potential. As I walked back across the red carpet toward my helicopter, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The scared 9-year-old girl who had arrived at this house carrying a single suitcase had grown into a woman who could literally fly away whenever she chose. But the most important realization was that my worth had never been determined by Richard's opinion of me. The confidence I felt now didn't come from his belated recognition of my success. It came from knowing that I had stayed true to my values while building something meaningful. The helicopter lifted off from Richard's manicured lawn, and I looked down at the family gathered below, waving goodbye as if I was some kind of celebrity gracing them with my presence. The symbolic power of that moment, the poor relation flying away in luxury while they watched from the ground, was impossible to ignore. But my story didn't end with that dramatic helicopter departure. The real satisfaction came in the months and years that followed, as I used my success to create opportunities for other people who, like me, had been written off because of their circumstances. The Sarah Chen Foundation grew into one of the most effective charitable organizations in the country, providing comprehensive support to thousands of young people who were aging out of foster care or living with reluctant relatives. We created mentorship programs that connected successful professionals with promising students, scholarship funds that covered full university expenses, and internship programs that provided real-world business experience. Every success story from our foundation felt like a personal victory, proof that talent and determination exist in every community regardless of economic circumstances. When Maria Gonzalez, one of our first scholarship recipients, graduated from MIT with a degree in engineering, I thought about the 9-year-old version of myself who had been told she was reaching above her station. When David Kim started his own technology company using skills he had learned through our entrepreneurship program, I remembered all the times Richard had suggested that I should focus on something more practical than my dreams of business success. When Angela Thompson became the first person in her family to graduate from college and went on to earn a law degree, I reflected on how different my life might have been if someone had believed in my potential from the beginning. My relationship with Richard's family evolved significantly after that Christmas dinner. Richard himself became one of the foundation's most generous donors, contributing both money and business expertise to help us expand our programs. He seemed genuinely committed to making amends for his past attitudes, though I never forgot the lessons I had learned about the difference between conditional and unconditional support. James and Sophia both reached out to me for career advice and professional networking opportunities. I helped them both, not out of any sense of family obligation, but because I had learned that success is more meaningful when it's shared with others. Victoria became involved with the Foundation's fundraising efforts, using her social connections to introduce us to other potential donors and supporters. Her transformation from someone who had treated me like household staff to someone who genuinely respected my achievements was perhaps the most surprising aspect of this entire experience. But the relationship that mattered most was the one I built with myself. The helicopter entrance at Richard's Christmas dinner had been a moment of personal triumph, but it was only one moment in a much larger journey of self-discovery and growth. I learned that proving other people wrong is satisfying, but proving yourself right is transformative. Richard's opinion of my potential had been irrelevant from the beginning. The only opinion that truly mattered was my own. The little girl who had been told she was too poor to be part of the family had grown up to understand that real family isn't about wealth or social status. It's about the people who believe in your potential even when you don't believe in it yourself, who support your dreams even when they seem impossible, and who celebrate your successes without jealousy or reservation. My helicopter arrival at Richard's house became a legendary story in our extended family, retold at every subsequent gathering with details that grew more elaborate with each telling. But for me, it represented something much more important than just a dramatic moment of vindication. It was proof that the circumstances of your birth don't determine the trajectory of your life, that intelligence and determination can overcome almost any obstacle, and that the best response to people who underestimate you is simply to exceed their wildest expectations. The sound of those helicopter rotors cutting through the evening air was the sound of dreams becoming reality, of hard work paying off in ways that even I hadn't imagined possible, and of a young woman who had refused to let other people's prejudices define her potential. As I flew away from Richard's estate that night, looking down at the lights of the city where I had spent my childhood feeling like an outsider, I knew that the most important part of my story wasn't the wealth I had accumulated or the success I had achieved. It was the knowledge that I had transformed every obstacle into an opportunity, every dismissal into motivation, and every moment of doubt into determination. The helicopter ride was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the girl who was once considered too poor to matter had become wealthy enough to change lives, including her own. In the months that followed that Christmas dinner, my relationship with Richard's family underwent a complete transformation that revealed as much about their character as it did about the power of success to change perceptions. Richard, who had spent years treating me with barely concealed contempt, suddenly became my biggest supporter and advocate, bragging about my achievements to anyone who would listen. The change in his behavior was both satisfying and somewhat disturbing. He would call me regularly to discuss investment opportunities, asking for my advice on financial matters with the same deference he might show to a renowned expert. He began introducing me to his business associates as his brilliant niece who had built a technology empire from nothing, conveniently omitting the years when he had dismissed my potential and refused to support my education. Victoria's transformation was equally dramatic but perhaps more genuine. She seemed genuinely remorseful about the way she had treated me during my childhood, and she made efforts to include me in family events and social gatherings in ways that had never happened before. She even joined the board of my foundation, bringing her considerable social connections and fundraising experience to help expand our programs. James and Sophia both reached out to me for career guidance and professional networking opportunities, suddenly treating me like the successful family member they had always wished they could be. James was working at a mid-level position in a marketing firm and asked if I might have openings at my company. Sophia had been struggling to establish herself as an interior designer and wanted to know if I could provide referrals or recommendations. I helped them both, not out of any sense of family obligation or desire for revenge, but because I had learned that success is more meaningful when it's shared with others. James ended up thriving in our company's marketing department, where his creativity and social skills proved valuable in explaining complex financial technology to consumer audiences. Sophia found success designing offices for several of our institutional clients, work that allowed her to combine her aesthetic talents with the business connections I could provide. Perhaps the most meaningful relationship that developed was with my younger cousin Emma, James's daughter, who was only 12 when I made my helicopter entrance but old enough to understand that something significant had happened. Emma began visiting me regularly, and I found myself mentoring a young girl who reminded me of myself at that age. Emma was brilliant and curious, with a natural aptitude for mathematics and science. I arranged for her to attend coding camps and helped her with advanced courses, teaching her that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle. She represented a new generation of our family, One that would understand that worth isn't determined by circumstances of birth but by character and effort. The Sarah Chen Foundation continued to grow and evolve, becoming one of the most effective charitable organizations focused on supporting young people who had aged out of foster care or were living with reluctant relatives. We expanded our programs to include not just scholarships and mentorship, but also housing assistance, mental health support, and entrepreneurship training. One of our most successful initiatives was the Young Entrepreneurs Program, which provided seed funding and business guidance to promising young people who wanted to start their own companies. Many of the participants reminded me of myself at that age, brilliant and driven but lacking the family connections and financial resources that could turn their ideas into reality. The program's first success story was Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old who had aged out of foster care and was living in a homeless shelter while attending community college. He had developed a mobile app that could help other homeless individuals find available shelter beds and social services, but he lacked the resources to properly develop and market the technology. Through our program, Marcus received $50,000 in seed funding, mentorship from experienced technology entrepreneurs, and office space in one of our innovation centers. Within 2 years, his app had been adopted by homeless service organizations in over 100 cities, and he had built a company that was generating significant revenue while providing genuine value to one of society's most vulnerable populations. Stories like Marcus's reminded me why the work of the foundation was so important and why Richard's cruelty during my childhood had ultimately served a greater purpose. Every young person we helped represented a potential that might otherwise have been wasted, a brilliant mind that society had written off because of circumstances beyond their control. The technology company continued to grow and evolve as well, expanding beyond financial markets into healthcare analytics, environmental monitoring, and educational technology. Our artificial intelligence algorithms were being used to predict disease outbreaks, optimize renewable energy systems, and personalize learning experiences for students around the world. Perhaps the most personally satisfying project was the development of a financial literacy platform specifically designed for young people aging out of foster care or living in unstable family situations. The platform was offered completely free to anyone under the age of 25, funded by the profits from our institutional clients. By the time I turned 30, Predictive Analytics Solutions had grown into a multinational corporation with offices in 12 countries and over 2,000 employees. The company's public offering had valued us at over $15 billion, making my personal stake worth more than $10 billion and placing me among the youngest self-made billionaires in history. But the number that mattered most to me wasn't my net worth or the company's valuation. It was the more than 50,000 young people who had been helped by our foundation's programs. Each scholarship awarded, each mentorship relationship facilitated, and each successful business launched represented a life that had been changed for the better. The annual Foundation Gala became one of the most prestigious charitable events in the country, attracting celebrities, business leaders, and politicians who wanted to support our mission. Richard and Victoria attended every year, and Richard would always make a point of telling anyone who would listen about how proud he was of his niece's achievements. There was something both touching and pathetic about his need for reflected glory, his desperate desire to be associated with success that he had played no role in creating. But I had learned to forgive his past behavior, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger would have diminished my own happiness and effectiveness. The 10th anniversary of my helicopter arrival at Richard's Christmas dinner was marked by a celebration at my Napa Valley estate, where I had built a house that made his mansion look like a guest cottage. The entire extended family attended, along with friends, business associates, and foundation board members. During the dinner, I stood up to make a toast that acknowledged how far we had all come and how much we had all learned about the true meaning of family and success. I talked about the importance of supporting young people who face challenges similar to what I had experienced, and I announced a major expansion of our foundation's programs. But I also took a moment to thank Richard, not for his support during my childhood, but for the motivation his cruelty had provided. His dismissal of my potential had become the fuel for achieving something he himself had never imagined possible. His lack of faith in me had taught me to believe in myself with unshakable conviction. Richard's face during that toast was a complex mixture of pride, regret, and amazement. I could see him processing the magnitude of what I had accomplished and perhaps finally understanding the role his own actions had played in shaping my determination to succeed. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Richard asked if he could speak with me privately. We walked out onto the terrace that overlooked my vineyards, where the lights of the valley spread out below us like a constellation of possibilities. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that I had never heard before, "I want you to know that your success has taught me something profound about potential and character. I spent so many years believing that advantages could be inherited or purchased, but you've shown me that real success comes from something much more valuable, the refusal to accept other people's limitations on what you can achieve." He paused, looking out over the landscape that represented just one small piece of the empire I had built through intelligence, determination, and relentless hard work. "I wasted years failing to recognize the most important advantage of all, your brilliant mind and unbreakable spirit," he continued. "You've not only proven me wrong about everything I believed about success and potential, but you've used that success to create opportunities for other young people who might otherwise be overlooked or dismissed." As I listened to his words, I realized that the scared 9-year-old girl who had been told she was too poor to be part of the family had grown into someone who could redefine what family actually meant. True family wasn't about blood relationships or inherited wealth, it was about the people who believed in your potential, supported your dreams, and celebrated your successes without jealousy or condition. The helicopter that had carried me to Richard's Christmas dinner 7 years earlier was now just one of several aircraft I owned, housed in a private hangar at an airfield I had purchased near my primary residence. But that flight remained one of the most meaningful journeys of my life, marking the moment when I had definitively proven that circumstances don't determine destiny. The sound of those helicopter rotors cutting through the evening air had been the sound of dreams becoming reality, of hard work paying off in ways that exceeded my wildest expectations, and of a young woman who had refused to let other people's prejudices define her potential. Standing on my terrace that night, looking out over a business empire that employed thousands of people and a foundation that had changed thousands of lives, I understood that the best revenge truly was living well. But even better than revenge was the knowledge that my success had created opportunities for other young people who faced the same challenges I had once confronted. The little girl who had once been told she was too poor to matter had become someone whose wealth and influence could matter in the lives of countless others. And that transformation, from victim to victor to advocate, represented the most meaningful achievement of all.